listening to the Curio-city Collective podcast.
I'm Arpita.
And I'm Deepika. So the episode we're airing this time is actually one that was meant to air in April. But as things happened at a rapid pace and the COVID-19 lockdown was put into place, we at the Curio-city Collective felt that it would be more appropriate to speak to the times, to the immediate questions that came to us collectively. So of course we shifted our focus to discuss the topic of care and connection during COVID, and then to lockdown and labor during the last few months. But 2020 is really turning out to be a bit of an epic year. It's barely been half the year, and as a country we found ourselves facing not only COVID, but also other serious disasters like the 2 cyclones on our 2 coasts, the locust attacks which swept across the country, and the humanitarian crisis surrounding the migrating laborers, and then of course the threat of quakes in the north of the country, to say the least. What's interesting is that in many ways these are all, including the pandemic, very complex outcomes of human impact on the planet, as we've been discussing in our previous episodes. And all of these situations combined are presenting a narrative of crisis which is telling us that our current way of doing things is just not working. And that's why we decided to go back to this theme of the frugal city for this month. Because as the 4th month of the crisis rolls out, many of us have started wondering, if not this, then what? And the 2 episodes within this theme are, in our opinion, opening one such door into reflecting on and beginning to understand new ways of doing and being. We hope you find yourself nodding along as you listen. Happy listening.
Okay, I'm getting the feeling that a lot of our episodes are beginning with you traveling to some place or the other. This time it's Himachal, and in the summers, and you're in Himachal, and I'm in Bangalore, sitting in the sweltering heat, and I receive these beautiful, beautiful, gorgeous snaps of the Himalayan range, and of course followed by that house you were at Bir, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that house was really, really beautiful. It was this mud house, and I think you sent me a cascade of snaps. There was the high ceiling, this angle of light, distance shot between deodars, everything, right?
Yeah, so I'd gone up to visit an old family friend who's built a mud house in Bir. And I've been hearing stories about this house for the last 6 years. It was constructed by this woman called Didi Contractor, who's an architect, and she's now 93 years old, but she did this when she was 86.
Wow.
Yeah, it's quite crazy. And I was listening to her interviews because I was curious about her life, and she mentions someone called Chitra Vishwanath, who's an architect based in Bangalore. And Chitra started Biome Environmental Solutions in the early 90s and now builds, on the principles of sustainability in cities. And
which we've been discussing forever, of course.
Yeah, and I was curious to know what that means and, how does that actually happen? So that's what brought me to Chitra.
So Chitra Vishwanath here. I'm an architect. I practice from Bangalore, part of a firm called Biome Environmental Solutions, which I was kind of instrumental in starting in 1990 as Chitra Vishwanath Architects, because lack of any imagination to give a name. The beginning of my practice was more of economical in nature and not ecological, because 1990 was a watershed year in Indian economy itself. The economy opened up and there were loans available for middle class, and the middle class started making its own homes. And there was also at HUDCO a great priority given for working with alternative materials, and especially what Laurie Baker espoused, the architecture of frugality, which is what I was much influenced by, rather than just his way of construction, more of frugality, like build just as much as you need.
When she was talking about Laurie Baker, as soon as she mentioned his name, I thought of you because I know how much you love his work.
I can't remember when I first heard of him, but I think I've been sort of secretly nurturing the idea of, building something, anything by his principles. So Laurie Baker was called the Gandhi of architecture, and this was partly because he was a Gandhian and partly because of his Quaker roots. Simplicity was part of his life. And this basically meant that he was speaking of building as per need and not greed. And I love his story. He was this British man who walked into India one fine day and found his degree of architecture completely useless because he had grown up in a temperate region, right? And the tropical region, tropical India, completely confounded him. It was just so different that he was humbled into learning from the locals. And so that's how localization happened. It wasn't some principle he arrived at. It just happened. And these fanciful terms that we use, like, cost effectiveness and energy efficient architecture, that just came naturally with that.
Yeah, and I think, what you said about need versus greed, it's something that Chitra said is why she also chooses to build with mud, because it's in line with the principles of Laurie Baker's, philosophy and building. And it allows for so much because you're going back to simpler forms and necessity versus, wanting to exploit and extract more and more.
The essence of frugality is that you build what you need, but you don't do something extra at all. So you build it beautifully. So the structures are beautiful. The mason feels good. We all feel good that it's built well. And it's also much more honest. You really see what you're building and how it is built. And even if a block gets bad, you can replace it with another block, which you can't do in a plastered, painted building. You don't know what's happening inside. So that way, it is better. I and most of us would prefer to do most of the work in the cities, to bring the city into the ecological schema. So this has been our concern most of the time, and we're doing it in the smallest possible plot too. And we are doing it for small families who are not going to be able to sit there and if small crack develops, take little mud and plaster it.
She was describing to me what those mud blocks are, and they're called CSEBs, which is short for compressed stabilized earth block, which is largely a mud block, but it has about 5 or 10% of cement that's mixed in to act as a stabilizer.
And where is this mud coming from? I'm guessing Laurie Baker, so locally?
Very locally, so from your own land, on the foundations of your house. And if not, then as close to that as possible, because the idea is not to, traipse across half the country to get more and more soil.
First thing we try is that we'll build with soil if available. And then we explore that, and also different soil can be modified. Now, this doesn't happen with any other material. So you have a soil, and then you start looking at, there's quarry dust available or fly ash is available and there's lime available. If we mix, what happens to that? So we've used in Bhopal mostly with fly ash and lime and soil, because the soil was very different. The building is grey rather than brown like here. But in Tadoba, you got soil of different kind. What's nice about it that it's not something which is just intuitive. You don't pick up and say, I'll make this, which is what happens in traditional mud. Because that comes from a long association of working with it. But here you require science. You have to get the soil tested. You have to do a lot of different mix in the lab.
So this must really result in unique looking buildings because, obviously the soil's unique to the landscape.
Yeah, and she's built across the country, and depending on where she is, of course, and the buildings look different because the soil and its quality and color is different, and you can see that in the construction. But she was talking about something that was even more interesting, which is embodied energy costs, and explaining what that meant.
Embodied energy is the amount of energy required to make a product. So making, let's say, an earth block, the maximum embodied energy comes from the cement which goes in. Otherwise, it's the soil which you have taken from your own basement. You have calorific value there. There are about 6 people making the block. So that's there. And the machine keeps reusing it. You make at least 1 lakh blocks and then you only service it. So it can be used for 10, 20 years.
Okay, I'm not sure I got that.
So how, usually we look at costs in terms of money, right? So you look at how much a can of paint costs or how much a brick costs or what that bag of cement is going to mean and how many you need. But now imagine a parallel scale where you're measuring as per energy and not money. So that same, dabba of paint, that same brick, that same bag of cement how much energy has gone into making it? Where is it coming from? What is that transportation cost involved? So everything is built into that energy cost, and that's how you come up with a different and parallel way of looking at it.
Okay, so it's a different measure. I get that. But what are you achieving out of figuring the energy cost?
Lots of times money doesn't actually reveal the cost of something. I mean, it's a transaction, but all those hidden costs that, ecologically you're looking at what it's, what that's resulting in, none of that is factored in. And by looking at the embodied energy cost of anything, and it's, every material we use in our life, it's not just construction materials, all of that gives you that bigger picture, which I think that simple money transaction loses. And she was using the example of paint to talk about what the difference is between embodied energy and a mud brick to explain that.
In paint, there are a lot of chemicals and everything which goes in, which is in a factory, which would be somewhere beyond, and you will be transporting it to the place. So all those are different energies which get accumulated into a product. So that's what's embodied energy. So I'm just comparing leaving a wall unfinished, unplastered, and unpainted compared to just a coat of paint. That will be the difference.
And in her conclusion, she was saying that the embodied energy of paint is actually 102 times more than that of an earth block, that you make from your own soil.
Yeah, I think that drives the point home. I mean, then you understand the difference between how something is costed in, through money and through energy.
Yeah, and when she said paint, the first thing I thought of was my house in Mumbai, where every year after the monsoon, the houses, the walls will get moldy and they'll swell and the ceiling will drip. And, you're already scheduling that annual paint and refurbishment because you have to. And it's money that you just plan for in the year because it has to be done. But at no point have I ever said, why does this need so much investment in this way?
It is seriously odd that we haven't thought of this before.
Yeah, and you're going to love what she said next, which is about frugality and how she defines that within her kind of architecture.
The building should be especially built where we should know whether that development can provide for its water, can treat its own waste in the plot where they are, provide for most of its energy, provide for biodiversity. These are 4 or 5 things, and provide for a little bit of food too. These are 5 elements. Let's put it in the bylaws. Show us this would happen in your plot. Then you build as much as you want. Not on the basis of width of the road, the land size. So then this is the FSI, and you can build that much. And then you build, and you leave it. You leave it for 5 years, 10 years. The prices just keep going up, and you're just making profit on something very invisible, economics, which is, it's exploitative. Yeah, it's exploitative economics, which is why it's not working.
Okay, this I do understand, sustainability. So basically what she's saying is that we're not building as individuals apart from the world that we live in. We're building as creatures very much embedded within the ecosystem, right?
Yeah, and I love that reminder that we're part of the ecosystem. I know I forget, often, especially when you're sitting in your own house and stuff, you don't think that you're connected to that larger world. But I think the house reflects that. And she was talking about how you need to give back and look at yourself as part of that larger space. And talking about it actually in the context of her 800 square foot basement.
What it does, it tells you the carrying capacity. So if you have done a foundation, the soil which you got, let's say 100 CFT of soil you got. So that means with that, only certain amount of walling can you do. That means your foundation or your basement is telling you only this much of construction should you do in this land, because that's the amount of soil you got. More than that is you're bringing material from elsewhere. And so that's why we talk about carrying capacity. So once we say you got the earth from your land, so you decide how big you're making, then you decide how big a basement you make. Or you say, yeah, you are ready to give the extra soil to somebody else. Fine. So let's say you used all of it. So from our basement of about 800 square feet, we made 1,500 and another house of about 800 square feet. So let's say 2,000 square feet you could make from 800 square feet, 2,000. But so you decide on that, you did 100 square feet, you can do 200 square feet of house. That's maybe a rule of thumb you could take. Then you decide on how much water falls on your terrace and how much water will you be able to collect and stay within that parameter. And then do you have land to treat your wastewater? Do you have land to recharge? If you start looking at this whole concept, you decide on how much should you be building on the land. Then it's not, then it's like any animal which builds its burrow. How much it can dig, it goes in, how big a nest can you make for the 3 chicks which will be growing. That's all you make. You don't make more than that.
I really like the way she's put that. Planning for a home just like any little forest dwelling creature would.
Yeah, it's a new way of looking at homes. And yeah, like as you said, I love the idea of being part of that ecosystem.
Yeah, but I think the question that's sort of going to pop into everyone's mind is, what is the cost? And I hear mean obviously the money kind. And is it much, much more expensive?
It's not actually, and it's something Chitra said they had to actively work on because they didn't want it to be this alternative, construction. They wanted to have competitive and comparable costs to a Main Street building, and that's what they did then.
So let's take, Deepika, the first one about cost. It's not more expensive than a designed building. So you can't compare it with a building built by a mason, head mason. You can't compare to that. And a design building and this is an apple to apple comparison. Yeah. So that's what it should be. So a design building will certainly be a little more expensive than what a mason does, because they wouldn't use the kind of inputs a design brings in. And that design brings in inputs which would be better for your life in terms of light, ventilation, etc. Minimum of that. So this is not more expensive, which is what we have always felt, Biome has always tried to do, is that it cannot be more expensive. If at all, it should be cheaper. It's cheaper in terms of maintenance. It's the same cost as a conventional building, because if you're going to make it more expensive, it is unecological. So through about 10 years of work where one had studied the materials which go in, how much labor goes, etc., we could come up to something called an item rate estimate. So we made our own estimates. And we could give that to the client after a design is done. It helped. It helped for the idea of this kind of construction spreading because it also provided an ethical base. Here, it's not only the design you get a team to build, but also you would know how much you would spend and where you're spending, and you're monitored. And this was very important. And to us, it felt that that is the only way an alternative construction can become something which is possible for most to adopt, because it follows something which is in the mainstream.
So I think I'm now getting a hang of the kind of architecture Chitra is speaking of. But I'm really curious. How did she even get there? How did she arrive at these principles?
She's had a really interesting life, and she grew up literally all over the map, from Banaras to Nigeria to Ahmedabad and back.
I was born in Banaras. My father was teaching in BHU, and we were South Indians there. So we always had very young kids who were studying in BHU who had come from South, coming home. So that was an open house for, in fact, on Sundays and Saturdays, there were more people than the family who would be eating. Then we went to Nigeria, and our house was again very open for everybody to walk in. And my mother was an extremely good cook, so there was everybody eating.
She was saying that, that idea of having an open home where lots of people came into, that was one thing. But CEPT, which is the Center for Environmental Planning and Technology, it's where she studied, and it's one of the best institutes of its kind, that also formed and shaped her idea of how she looked at shared spaces.
The shared spaces happened through the architecture of SEPT, School of Architecture, where no classroom was a classroom, where you couldn't go. You walked to a classroom through other classrooms. You stayed in a we called it studio. You worked in a studio, but you could look at a studio below. You could shout at your juniors or your seniors about the music they played, or you could also see what they're doing. Their own class, if you're interested, you could just go sit. I think that has remained in us. And you'd find that as a very common feature in our homes and stuff that you could see anywhere. It was difficult for people to accept that, but our house is also very open. We could see it from living room to my son's room, and if you went in our rooms, you had mezzanines. So this is, I think, from the built aspect of it is from Ahmedabad, from the studies there. Just want to move and see everybody.
But when did Biome actually come to be?
So Biome started in the early 1990s, and she started it, after she met her husband at SEPT, and he was also a student there, and they fell in love and got married and moved to Bangalore. And at the time, none of her clients wanted to experiment with a mud block house. So they decided that they'd do it themselves, and, they chose a plot of land and built their own house and now live there together.
We were lucky to build our own house. And when we came to see the plot and we saw our neighbor constructing and this beautiful red earth which was there, we decided we should build with earth blocks. And we were very keen to build with earth blocks, but was very difficult to convince clients to do it. First, we had no prior experience. So we decided to do our own house, and we decided to make a basement because I knew that the earth required will not be enough coming out from foundation. So we did a basement. I call it the worst basement, but the first one. So we learned a lot from doing that. We got earth enough to not only build our house and also a small house nearby where we couldn't do basement. I don't know if I went about seriously that I have to do mud or something, but we got sucked into it, happily sucked into the whole effect of it, the whole challenge that you have to get a soil which is right. And every time you go anywhere now, I keep looking at soil and get very thrilled about the kind of soil is available. And it's so versatile that it may not be the soil, what it looks like in Bangalore, but elsewhere, then it's a challenge. How do I use that?
So you actually interviewed her in her office space and visited her home, right? So aesthetically and spatially, did it feel different, and was it a lot like the Beer place?
It's very different from most places I've been in, but it actually evoked the sensation that I had when I was in that house in Beer, which is of spaciousness. And when your bare feet make contact with the mud floor, that grounding that comes with it. And I think it's also that interplay of light and the use of light and air. So it always feels like there's flow within the house. And she was saying in her office also and pointed that out to me, that how you look at volumes and how volume can increase a sense of space. So while a plot might be small and might be 800 square feet, the actual volume of it is much larger.
The small plot can't be seen as area. It's better to see it as volume. That thing we were sure that we need to see volumes of. You see, this room is an area. Okay. Now, when you see our office, it's a volume. If you see area is just about, say, 1,000 square foot, but the volume is much larger. And the notion of space to be brought through volumes rather than by areas. Everybody comes and says, you want a 14 by 14 bedroom. But our house has 8 by 10 bedroom, but the volume is higher. At a certain place where the sleeping space is only 8 feet, the other place is 14 feet. So the heights become more and you don't feel claustrophobic. It's a thing, and the smaller, experiential stuff. And the light comes from different ways. So modulation of light is essential in these places.
Yeah, I like the idea of exploring volume alongside area because, a house is also its empty spaces, right? It's not just the walls.
Yeah, and that effect is incredible. I went up to the upper level of her office and there's this huge bank of windows on the left, and it looks out onto trees. And the space outside there is reflective of, the space inside, and there's an intermingling of that outer and inner world.
So as I was listening to Chitra, I was thinking how, Bangalore's changed a lot since the last decade or so, and it's gone from being the sleepy little, small residential kind of space to now increasingly having a lot of high rises, right? So did Chitra speak to this? How do we begin to deal with this sustainably?
Well, she did actually, and the easy answer is that it's possible. But the question that she flipped back to me was, what is your reason for building that high rise? Again, in that question of need versus greed, is it for your own need and your family, or is it an investment and something that, then that money is being made of? And then looking at that in the context of it being ecological or not and what that cost is.
Well, yeah, because we do hear of how many of these apartment blocks are actually empty because these are houses made for investment. Well, my second thought was this. Considering the city that's already standing all around us, it is largely made of concrete, right? So now what?
We talked about that, and actually her response was encouraging because there's simple things that we can do to sort of transform, even these concrete blocks into ecosystems.
We are so blessed. We are in tropical climate. So put plants, put trees. The basic, which requires the least amount of intervention, least amount of financial problems with you. Plant trees, plant anything. From the terrace, don't leave the terrace gray, make it green. And that's, anybody can do it. It reduces urban flooding because the plants will take up, and it creates a space for biodiversity, for pollinators to grow. You don't worry. Put soil and let grass grow, let wildflowers grow. Don't work on it. It requires that during construction, you do a good job to allow for water to move away, which is very basic, good construction, I think. And you would make a huge difference in the city. I'm not asking about that the building should look fantastic, but the building should be amenable for biodiversity. And that would change the way people would feel. You see a bird, you see a monkey also, you feel happier than seeing just a brick wall or a glass wall. So I think it's important that we bring in biodiversity. So it's very important in future that we bring in more trees and bring in more animals in our midst. On our terrace, you just pick up a pot, a real ceramic WC from which is thrown everywhere, put it with soil there, you can grow anything you feel like. It's important that we start doing that. We work with soil. We have to start creating soil. So composting as well as putting plants. I think these two things are future.
When she was describing green spaces and green roofs, I was thinking about how France in March 2015 had legislated this. So rooftops on new commercial buildings have to either be covered in solar panels or in plants, and like green basically. And the idea is that a green roof is able to have that isolating effect. It can reduce the amount of energy you need to heat or to cool. It retains that rainwater, it's encouraging birds and butterflies. And
absolutely. That's what I've been trying to do with my terrace, right?
Yeah, and that's why I love your terrace, because it just feels like it's thriving with different sorts of life forms. And I was thinking of you when I was on her terrace because it's completely green. And she has these blue discarded water tanks where, she's got these mini trees. And was saying that, they grew rice on their roof for 2 years.
Can you grow rice on your roof? I've never heard of it before. It needs standing water.
Yeah, I would have thought so, but there's clearly different ways of doing it. And they had enough that they need to buy rice for 2 years.
So looking at it as an ecosystem, and we don't see humans as only parasitic. Could they be useful? So one of it is the way we build. The future we are looking at is, in fact, even going beyond the use of mud blocks alone, that looking at use of waste from the city as a quarry rather than city as something which is taking materials from the outlying areas and making itself. Because we need to and we do break buildings. But we are right now looking at it only as a waste, but that could be a resource. And it's not something that we have come up with. It's a thought process which is going on everywhere. And we need to be incorporating waste into the building and create the built itself as something which would always be available for future as a quarry. Break a building and then you make a new building and from the same material or from some other buildings which is broken, but it should be a space for itself. So the city should become a space where it holds its own waste and uses it for constructing itself.
The idea of the city constructing itself from its own past, I mean, that's very interesting. And I think we're in the absolute opposite direction right now. So how do we begin to change that?
Well, it's a direction Chitra said she wants to move to. And, she said ultimately doing away with that title of architect.
What architecture gives you is the chance to converse. And to me, that's becoming more important, to be able to talk to people, because through design, you can talk and you can see what they're picking up and how they're going to respond, and you can affect lives. And that's the most interesting part. And that's part of being in the earth. And I don't think it needs to be that you have to build with earth. The material you use, it plays a very small role. If you can make with any material an ecosystem, that is better. I'd rather be called an architect of an ecosystem, which is what I would, because then it would make me work harder. But that's better than just saying earth architect. How is the insert of a building is a positive part of the ecosystem, rather than it being something which is taking everything fresh and throwing out waste. So if we can do that more and more as architects, then in fact the whole profession of architecture itself should slowly vanish and should become part of ethos of everybody. I can build a house and this is what I have to do. And it's very simple things. And I make spaces which I can share with others rather than just make for ourselves and put these locks and keys. And even if you have extra, but then you don't share it, it's not fair. So that's the space which I want to move to.
I have to admit that while what she's describing sounds beautiful, I don't know, don't you feel it sounds slightly utopian? Because, I mean, we're sitting here surrounded by concrete, right?
There is more to it than that. And, things are changing. And some of the things she was telling me about Bangalore, I'd heard for the first time.
There are about 7,000 buildings in Bangalore, which are built with earth, with stabilized earth. That's the largest concentration of earth buildings in the world, in one city. And we don't talk about it. And there's so many people who are building. And now in this city, you have at least 10 entrepreneurs who are making blocks and selling. They have seen that as a possibility. And now it satisfies me so much that you get into a little lane and you see one little house coming up with these blocks, which they've bought off the shelf. And some of them are so good, they're using all sorts of waste and making the blocks and selling it. So this is what's important, that it's becoming a common lingo rather than it becoming like, I need to see some 100,000 homes of mud blocks. No, it's more important that it becomes something which people use it. It's readily available as an alternative.
Bangalore has 7,000 buildings made of mud by these Laurie Baker Chitra principles. That is just, that's just amazing. I would have never guessed that, no.
Yeah, I wanted to stick little pins on them and do a walking tour and see what the city looks like from that angle. But when I was sitting there and listening to Chitra talking about these ideas of frugality, I was thinking about a conversation we've had, about how that word, it evokes a sense of having less, or there's an association actually with it being less and almost poverty in some ways. But when I was in that mud house and her office and even the one up in Beer, there's a sense of abundance there. There's something very generous about being in a space that, uses light in that way or material in that way and, all that greenery. And it's strange because the aspiration is to have more and, sort of look posh and fancy and all of those things. But the sensation that these spaces evoke is actually that. It's that abundance that we're all seeking in many ways. But, if we could experience and connect with that, it makes so much more sense to me. And that's a city that I would live in and would proudly call Frugal.
So I really want to see the city as an ecosystem. And it's a possibility, I feel. So city as a forest, and not by just planting trees, but planting them sensitively and understanding all sorts of things. And so I want to see sparrows back. I want to see a lot more butterflies and bees in the city, residing in the city rather than the outskirts. So I would like to really see it that way. I want to see a lot more shared spaces. I want to see people sitting outside, which is so good here, but we still don't do. I want to see a lot more benches on the road and which people are using it rather than cafes only. I wanted even more of equity in the whole scene. I would like to sometimes think of it as going back to a stage where it's more like an agora. They're just snatches of philosophy, but what Socrates said I really like is that if possible, people are able to converse more. And so if it's one-to-one conversation, I'd get to know what you're thinking of what I'm saying, rather than being in the room or writing a book, and that's what people are going to be able to see. So if that's possible, it's so much better. If we can make more spaces. I want a city where the young people, and especially women, are out, even at 12 in the night alone. That will be the best city I'd really like to be in.
To know more about earth architecture and building with mud, visit www.biome-solutions.com. In our next episode, we chat with S. Vishwanath, Chitra's partner and another member of the Biome family. Famously known by his online moniker, Zen Rain Man, he speaks to us about how he got hooked onto issues related to water and rainwater harvesting in particular. Don't forget to listen in at www.thecuriositycollective.org. This episode has been made with the support of Srinidhi Raghavan and produced by the Bangalore Recording Company.